Hello, I'm Maria Hall Brown. Welcome to Protest and Promise. This is a great opportunity for young Angelenos to have their voices heard and also ask questions of community leaders here in the city of Los Angeles. So today I'm delighted that we have as our guest Malaika Billups. She is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the Personnel Department for the city of Los Angeles. And then we have our wonderful panel of young Angelenos. Wave when I say hi. There's Bridget. And of course, Alex, and we have Chris, and Evan, and Cameron. Great to have you all back, and that's really sincere in the fact that it's really nice to see you all again, because I know that you've been part of this show for a while, and I really appreciate your thoughtful input and all of your intelligent questions. And thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
All right, I have to ask the most basic question of all before we actually have a chance. So what does your job title mean?
That's a great question and a great place to start. So it basically means that I am the person or the go-to person within the personnel department who is leading the efforts to really look into issues of diversity, impacts of diversity, how to achieve workplace equity, and how to build a culture of inclusion within the personnel department and the city workforce all throughout the city. So I lead the Office of Workplace Equity.
Have you all been aware of any of the kinds of policies and programs that have been put into place, especially into places of employment? Have you noticed any of this? Bridget, have you seen it at all?
I personally haven't, but I have seen like just recently a lot of companies speaking out about like what is it, voter suppression, and seeing like corporate America like, you know, use their voice and their power and their platforms. That's kind of different because I feel like most companies would stay silent during most situations. And I feel like last year and this year, they kind of showed an initiative to try better, I guess.
Right, right. Has there been a renewed effort over at the city, do you feel?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we can't pretend like the George Floyd murder didn't change, I think, the world. It didn't change society. It was a time that really woke people up and I think brought more allies to the table, a table that had already been set. A lot of people have been making these calls to action for years, generations even. But I think this is really one of the first times that America has seen this sort of outpouring of support. And it's really, really inspirational to see all of the different pieces start to come together and people to start realizing that there are different ways to try to achieve what we're all now seeing we really need to achieve. So I know that's like broad strokes and that's very general, but definitely to answer your question specifically, I am seeing a lot of the efforts within the city to make the changes that I think are really important to make.
All right, I'm going to throw Alex under the bus here a little bit. Alex, I know that you've had some experience working within some of the governmental offices, you know, as an intern. So I'm wondering, prior to the unrest of last summer, do you think that that was a priority with the city or those that you had worked with? Do you feel like this is a great thing that there's this energy behind it now? What are your thoughts about what's going on out there now?
I think that there is some considerable focus on, biases within the workplace. Previous to the unrest, a lot of that focus was mostly on infrastructure and homelessness and, things of that nature. But now we're seeing efforts by a lot of elected officials to kind of appoint people to positions of power where that are usually for groups that usually aren't represented. So I've been seeing that happen, and it's been pretty great that we've been making these strides to equity.
All right, well, I'm going to, because we were, one of the things that we said we'd talk about today was implicit bias. So the first question I was wondering, there's a difference between racism and implicit bias.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, I think certainly implicit biases can lead to racism. I think there's a lot of big, broad things that come with racism, and I have a lot of discussions with people about this, like what does racism look like? Some people think it means that you wear a white hood and you go around committing hate crimes, and that is certainly one very extreme form of racism, but racism can also be very subtle. It can be insidious, it can be hidden, it can be accidental, and I think that that's one of the things that we talk about when we're talking about implicit biases. The city has made some efforts to teach city employees about implicit biases, and I think it's really important because implicit biases, which is also called unconscious bias, it's something that exists that you don't know exists in your mindset. And I think racism is a little bit more generally intentional. It's a little bit more conscious. It's something that you're more aware of. But you can have some of those biases against people who look different from you. You have biases against people who look the same as you. And that's something that's embedded in a lot of our cultures because these biases can come from societal influences. They come from the media. They come from, a lot of different areas. So there is, I think, a big difference, but they're also very interconnected.
Do you think any of you have been actually subject to a bias, not an overt or maybe even an overt racist intent, but maybe something more subtle like a bias? Chris, do you feel like you've ever been subject to someone else's bias that didn't feel as if it was, directly supposed to be hostile towards you, but it might be something that the person was unaware that they were affecting you?
No, definitely. A lot of times I see it also with, unfortunately, the younger, not as much as I used to, but like the younger generation, I had that a lot, where I'd be in places where I guess they aren't used to seeing people like me, and they would kind of treat me as if I not even didn't belong, but like they wouldn't understand. So like, for instance, one time I was in a shop or like in a space, and then the person, like, they had said something, but it seemed like they either, I don't know if it was racism, but I would say, I don't want to say what they said, but the way they said it, it was as if they've said it all the time. And so for me, it felt as if like, oh my God, like, why would he say that? Is like, why would that person say that? But then I had to think, like, maybe they don't even know that that's wrong. So that's one of the times that's happened, but it happens a lot. Especially like in like passerby, when you're just meeting people and someone might say something or might do something that might catch you off guard. But yeah, definitely.
What about you, Evan? Do you think you've had that experience and maybe you didn't even think about it until now we started talking about bias as being something subtle?
I do. The first thing that comes to mind is my name, actually, because my name is more gendered for men. Most people that have my name do identify as men, and I've had situations where like I've applied for a job and they think I'm a man, and I show up and they're very surprised, and they go and they reconsider, or and it also happens to be a white sounding name. So I think I really surprise people when I show up, and I think that would be a great example of implicit bias. It's not something that's very outward when you're reading names off of an application, but it is something that people consider.
Yeah, how does that affect employment? I mean, how does that affect the application process and everything like that? I mean, people in HR departments hiring have to be probably the most sensitive to accidental implicit bias.
Absolutely. I think implicit bias is something that it's not unique to one person. In fact, implicit bias is something that affects all of us. We all have been impacted by other people's implicit biases, and we all of us, have affected other people with our own implicit biases. And I think part of that is because, like I was saying before, implicit bias is part of the way that the brain functions, period. We all have certain biases. We have certain preconceived notions that we don't realize that we necessarily have. And so I think you're exactly right. I think being in the personnel department or the hiring process or in the workplace, if you are not consciously checking your implicit biases, then you are probably impacting people with those implicit biases. And that's why I think it's really important to talk about it. It's important for people to start thinking about and recognizing, well, what biases do I have? Are there patterns that are showing up in my hiring decisions, in my promotional decisions, and any of those things that I didn't realize were even there, that I didn't intend to put into my thought process, but that might actually be there. And that requires quite a bit of self-reflection. And it's a very important thing to do.
Have you been the victim of it at all, Bridget, or have you caught yourself? I mean, because that's the other thing, is that we're, as Malaika says, it's not something that you're doing intentionally, but you have to be conscious and aware of it. So have you had that experience, do you think?
I've definitely had bias towards this kind of weird, like, people that aren't POC. Like, I just expect them to be, I don't know, I expect them to be, like, not as open-minded as most people. But that's not always the case, since even, like, in my family, like, they could be racist and they could be homophobic. And in my mind, I see, like, a white person, and I'm like, like, they're probably very close-minded. And I've caught myself in multiple situations like that. And it's really weird that it's happened, since I work with a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds. So in my mind, I'm like, why do you think like that? And it's because it's like I've experienced, like, what is it called? Microaggressions from non-POC. And just that feeling that, I don't know, that you're not, that they're not expressing a microaggression towards me. I'm like, whoa, this is new. and it sucks that in my mind, I see non-POC that way. And I've caught myself, and I've kind of drifted from that mindset, because I don't want to hold bias towards people. Mm-hmm. I don't want to, yeah, that's kind of how I see my biases.
Wow, that's what you said is a little bit poignant in the fact that you're surprised when that microaggression doesn't rear its ugly head at you, which is right. Also kind of, I guess, in a interesting way, the fact that we're thinking and talking about this is better. But Kemery, you are so aware and so active when it comes to, righting some of the wrongs of history, and, you're very well spoken about this. Do you think this conversation about, bias and about racism and about, justice and equity and diversity and everything is actually working and is helping when it comes to trying to get messages out that maybe people were not willing to listen to before?
I was going to ask, what should be done for those people that are in positions of power that are, they pretty much have the fate of, Indigenous people, future in their hands. Are they stepping down from their jobs, or what's happening with that? I feel like that'll be more, maybe that'll speed things up if we start, going that route. It could go a lot faster is what I'm saying, because we're still so far behind. We're going to be playing catch up now. This is playing catch up. This isn't really like radical. This is us just trying to correct stuff that's been happening for way too long, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because people are asking for accountability. And it's not unreasonable to ask for accountability. But what does accountability look like? And also, what does productivity look like? And I think that you have to balance a lot of different factors. I can't make the decision about whether or not, other people are going to be, stepping down. I don't have that authority. But what I do think is that while people are in their positions, they need to be made aware of what the expectations are now. I mean, I don't know how to, there's a lot of efforts out there to correct like past wrongs. And that's one of the things that I talk about with, you know, people that I work with throughout the city. Like, there have been wrongs, and I think it's really important for the city to figure out kind of what those wrongs were, acknowledge them, and figure out a way to think about how to sort of support people through those wrongs, but also make sure they don't happen again. And my focus, at least in my role in the city, is really making sure that stuff doesn't happen again. Making sure that those people who are in those decision-making positions, those positions of power, are made aware of the expectations. And this is different than what we've done in the past in terms of telling people, you know, these are the things that you need to be looking for in a candidate that you're hiring, and the decision is just up to you. We're asking people to think about what are the methods that you're using to make sure that you are checking yourself when you're asking these questions, when you're looking at these applications. How are other people going to be sure that you are checking yourself? You know, like, what are the processes that you're going through? And the reality is, these are all learned skills. This is something that I wish some people probably are born there, like inherently, they kind of know how to do this stuff, but this is a skill set. Mm-hmm. It is something that, these are what people used to call soft skills. And people, I think, used to dismiss them as like, oh, these people skills and learning how to get along with people. People skills. That's a side thing. But emotional intelligence and being aware of how you're impacting people and how you're engaging with people and what impressions people are giving to you and why you're forming these impressions or opinions. It's a skill set that needs to be taught. And that's one of the big things that I really want to work with city leadership, with managers, with decision makers, is teaching them to be better, teaching them to incorporate equity into the decisions that they're making, whether it's at a simple letter, just hosting a meeting, hosting a staff meeting. I want you to think about aspects of that staff meeting that could create inequities. Who do you call on? What's the order in which you ask questions? How do you solicit feedback? Those are decisions that little tiny bits of equity are built into those small decisions, and I think overall that ultimately makes a big difference in the lives of the employees in the city. So it's a lot of work to teach people, you know, emotional intelligence and people skills.
But can you?
But you can.
Okay.
You absolutely can. I think with most people. Some people don't want to learn, and I can't stop that. And I think those, Kimmery, are the people who should not stay in those positions if they don't want to learn and grow. But that's the case whether it's a soft skill, a people skill, or a hard skill, learning how to, you know, like use technology or use any sort of new workplace component. You've got to learn and you've got to grow. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you don't, then the work will pass you by.
Okay, I'm going to give you like 1 minute to think of what you would like Malaika to be able to tell the city when they're talking about, you know, things they should be aware of from your vantage point, because you have a fresh perspective. And while I do that, I'm going to ask her really quick to Cameron's point. But is there now a culture in which people's misbehavior, you know, can be addressed because people are willing to step forward now and say things that they would never say before in order to help that turnover so that those people are not in the position of power that they were in before?
I absolutely think so. And I think that's one of the things that I'm excited about that we're doing in my group at the Office of Workplace Equity is the city. Now, this was years ago. The mayor created a program called My Voice LA that allows people to reach out to a neutral, to my group, to report incidents of discrimination, harassment, retaliation, so they don't have to run it up the chain within their own departments, report to their own supervisor the things that they know that their supervisor isn't going to listen to. They're reporting to my team now so that we, as sort of a neutral body, can look into, investigate, and make assessments on whether or not people are being treated fairly and properly within their own workspaces. So that's been around for a few years. at this point, and we're building it out and getting more people involved with it, which I think is a really important aspect of things. And that's, I think, one of the first steps of holding people accountable is by having clear policies. We've also been working on rolling out a new workplace equity policy, which really clearly defines, I mean, there's two different directions that you can go with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, at least from my perspective. One is protective measures, which I think are really important. Those are policies, those are enforcement procedures, those are accountability measures, those types of things. And those are very, very important because we have to have a baseline of behavioral expectations in the workplace. If you do X, Y, and Z, you will have to deal with these consequences. If you treat people a certain, very clear and specific way, we can't accept that here. So that's one aspect of what I think is really important. The other aspect is more of the proactive measures, which is when we're starting to talk about how do we change the culture for the better, not just dealing with the worst, but also really striving for the best, striving for that workplace culture where inclusion is the next step beyond diversity. Diversity is looking at, a variety of people, different faces, different backgrounds, and different experiences. But what we all know, and probably all of you have seen, and I'd love to hear from you about it, is you can be in a place where there's diversity, but that doesn't mean that you're listened to. That doesn't mean your voice is valued. That doesn't mean you're heard. It doesn't mean you really, really, really get to show up how you are, the way you are at work or at school or in classes. But that's what inclusion is, and that is what we are also working toward, is developing this culture of inclusion so that people can feel comfortable being like, I live in LA and I listen to country music. It is what it is. You know what I mean? You can be that person if you want to be, or you can be like, look, all I listen to is hip hop. This is my world. This is how I live, and feel like this is who I am and I don't have to be ashamed. It doesn't matter what it is. It's just being who, it's got to be obviously like workplace appropriate. We're still dealing with, workplace measures, but I think that building out that culture of inclusion is that next step beyond just enforcement and accountability. Okay. So there's a lot of different pieces that tie together in the work that we do, but we need allies and support.
Well, all right. So then, what should she add to that list, Chris? What should she include when she's talking about, because all of you are close to, if not already employed, you're looking at your life ahead of you. Chris, what should be included in those considerations for you in the future when you want to go out and make the life that you dream of?
Okay, so I'd say that first things first, I think there should be, there needs to be more opportunity. So in terms of like, how can I put this? Sometimes it's just the knowing. Sometimes it's just the knowing that you can go there. That's the first step. And then once you're able to know you can go there, whatever those opportunities are, especially if we're talking about job opportunities and that whole thing, then knowing that you can go there. And then once you're in there, getting a mutual understanding of like, knowing there's more than, I feel like a lot of times when you go into a space, there's already people that are at the top or at the lead that feel like they don't need to change anything they're doing. Everything is perfect. I think going in there and being able to say, there can be need for change. Like there can be a change that can happen. I don't know specifically how that can happen. I think those are the things that could be more so talked about. But I think like for me, just trying to go into just knowing that it's possible to have a grant for a nonprofit, like knowing I can do that, or knowing having a 501, or just knowing certain things that can take me somewhere else, because I'm living in South Central LA, and without certain programs and stuff, I would never know that existed. I would never know what I can do or what I wouldn't do. So to go to that, I've already started making 2 nonprofits that I'm working on at the moment. I would never do that if I didn't know. So me going from that point to now, it's definitely,
dissemination of information and opportunity. Okay, Evan, what do you want the employment workforce world look like when you step into it and are aiming for something that you want to be doing for the bulk of your day?
These advancements that we're seeing, from the past summer until now that we're talking about, they're just the first of many steps. It's not just, I think a lot of people are viewing it as a hill we need to get over, and then we come back down and everything's easy again. And then we don't need to have the Office of Equity, But there is so much more to go, and the point is to keep all of this around. It's not to, get past the Chauvin trials that are happening right now and then go on with our lives. That's not the point of this. And there's just so much more to inclusion than just race and gender. And, we're so multifaceted people, and there are so many of us here that we really need to focus on including everybody and wanting to be part of our communities, wanting to improve our communities, and that means including every single person.
Very profound. Alex, what do you think? What are some of the priorities that you think need to be added to the mix of what's been established so far?
Yeah, I think that the point made that there's a difference between representation and then inclusion is very important, because you can have a lot of faces within a workspace, but to actually have a voice within that conversation is a different issue. And although we have made some gains in terms of representation, and there's still a lot to be done. Our society, unfortunately, is embedded with a lot of these biases. There's a lot of history behind it for a lot of marginalized groups. It extends beyond just race, but includes, gender and a lot of other factors. So there's a lot of work to be done. Yeah. Definitely.
Camarine, besides getting rid of the bad, what are some of the things that you could add that would aid and abet the good?
All companies should really include a program that specifically pulls from HBCU graduates. Hundreds of us graduate every year, so there is no lack of HBCU African American student professionals. So HBCU is a historically Black college university, for those who didn't know what HBCU stood for. I would also say that companies need to look at the HR department as well and make sure that the people in those positions get their implicit biases in check, and also put Indigenous people in those positions as well. I also think that the companies should also include, they should allow African American professionals in their companies to congregate and have their own program as well for themselves. I think that I think that was it so far. But all in all, I do think that more Indigenous people, we need to create our own institutions in America, period, so we don't have to keep doing this dance also. I feel like that will reduce a lot of, problems as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, Bridget, here's your shot. What do you think should be added into the mix?
Biases aren't only found in the workforce. Like, they're found everywhere. They're found in healthcare and like in everyday situations. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's a point that I want to get across.
Well, it's a very complex and a very huge issue. I guess the best part about it is that we're talking about it, which hopefully means that they'll be continuing to talk about it. But Malaika, I'm going to give you the last hopeful, positive, and or realistic word for our young Angelenos. What would you want to leave them with?
Well, I can't imagine everyone doesn't say this at the end, but it's genuine, and I'm saying it from my heart. I am so impressed with you all. I think that you all have it. Like, you understand it, you get it, you see it, you connect to all these things, and I think you grew up knowing it. And there's so many people who are in the workforce who all these concepts are just completely unfamiliar. And they're learning it from scratch, which I think is kind of where Kimmery was coming from. Like, can we just get rid of the people who are there and start with the people who get it? But it's true, you understand it. So I am incredibly optimistic about what the future looks like, what it is that you all have to teach to the people who are learning this for the first time, because it is new for some people, and a lot of people do want to learn. There are a lot of people who want to learn, and I think a lot of that learning is going to come from your generation. So I want to thank you all for participating in this, and being so active, and just getting your voices out there. Thank you. I'm inspired.
Well, and I thank you, and it's great to see you all. Bridget, Alex, Evan, Chris, Cameron, be safe. Do well. Can't wait to talk to you again. And of course, Malaika, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
All right. Well, that's a wrap on another impressive Protest and Promise.